They said nothing could penetrate the Tiger's armor, that the Panzer was invincible, that German steel was forged by gods of war, yet by 1945 thousands of these iron beasts lay smoldering across Europe, their turrets blown off, their crews incinerated. What weapon broke the myth? Was it the American Sherman, ridiculed as a Ronson lighter that burned at the first hit? Was it Soviet hordes overwhelming with numbers, or was it something far more humble, something so overlooked, that history nearly forgot its name? The answer would cost thousands of lives to discover, and the men who found it would do so not through brilliance, but through desperation, blood, and a willingness to crawl into the jaws of death armed with nothing but obsolete weapons and impossible courage. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. To understand how the mighty fell, we must first understand how they rose. In the 1930s, while the world still remembered the trenches of the Great War, Germany rebuilt its military in secret. The Treaty of Versailles had forbidden tanks, so German engineers disguised them as tractors, tested them in the Soviet Union, and refined their designs in the shadows. When Hitler tore up the treaty, the panzers emerged not as experimental curiosities, but as perfected machines of conquest. The Panzer III and IV rolled through Poland in weeks, shattered France in 40 days, and pushed deep into the Soviet Union with a speed that made the world tremble. But the true terror came later. In 1942, the Tiger I appeared on the Eastern Front like a demon summoned from nightmares. It weighed 54 tons, its frontal armor was 4 inches thick, and its 88mm gun could destroy any Allied tank at ranges exceeding a mile. Soviet tankers who encountered it reported that their shells simply bounced off, ricocheting into the sky like pebbles thrown at a fortress. The Tiger could sit on a hillside and methodically obliterate entire columns before they even got close enough to fire back. German crews began to believe they were untouchable, that their steel cocoons made them immortal. The Panther tank followed in 1943, and it was in some ways even more dangerous. Faster than the Tiger, cheaper to produce, and armed with a 75mm gun that could slice through Allied armor like a sword through silk. Its sloped frontal armor was designed to deflect incoming rounds, a lesson learned from Soviet T-34 design. German tankers called it the perfect synthesis of firepower, protection, and mobility. They were not wrong. In Normandy, a single Panther could hold an entire intersection, destroying Shermans one after another, while their rounds sparked harmlessly off its glacis plate. American doctrine in the early war years was built on a fatal assumption that tanks would fight infantry and fortifications, not other tanks. The M4 Sherman was designed as an infantry support vehicle, meant to roll forward with soldiers, suppress machine gun nests, and blast through farmhouses. Its 75mm gun was adequate for those tasks. Its armor was enough to stop rifle fire and shrapnel. Its reliability was legendary. A Sherman could drive 500 miles without breaking down, something no German tank could claim. But when Sherman met Tiger, reliability meant nothing. The German gun could penetrate a Sherman from the front at 2,000 yards. The Sherman's gun could barely scratch a Tiger's front armor even at point-blank range. The result was a grotesque arithmetic of death. In Normandy, American tank crews calculated that it took 5 Shermans to destroy 1 Tiger. The first 4 would die drawing fire, maneuvering, trying to flank. The 5th might, if fortune smiled, get a shot at the Tiger's thinner side armor. Crews called it the Ronson treatment, after the cigarette lighter advertised to light on the first strike. Shermans burned so easily that tankers refused to load more than a few rounds at a time, knowing that a penetrating hit would cook off the ammunition and turn their vehicle into a crematorium. British tanks fared no better. The Churchill infantry tank was even slower than the Sherman, its gun even weaker. The Cromwell was fast but lightly armored and undergunned. Only the Firefly, a Sherman modified to carry a British 17-pounder gun, had a chance of penetrating German heavy armor, but there were never enough of them. British tankers learned to identify Fireflies from a distance and targeted them first, knowing they were the only real threat. The loss rate among Firefly crews was catastrophic. Soviet doctrine was different, but no less brutal. The T-34 was a magnificent tank for 1941, but by 1943, it was outmatched. Soviet commanders did not care. They had factories in the Urals producing tanks faster than Germany could destroy them. They sent wave after wave forward, accepting losses that would have broken any Western army. For every German tank destroyed, the Soviets lost 5, sometimes 10. But they had the numbers. German crews might destroy a dozen T-34s in a single engagement and still be forced to retreat because 50 more were coming, yet numbers alone do not explain what happened. If the war had been decided purely by tank versus tank combat, Germany might have held out far longer. The Tiger and Panther were genuinely superior machines in direct confrontation. But war is not a duel between knights, it is chaos, mud, logistics and desperation, and in that chaos a different kind of weapon emerged, one that had been there all along but was dismissed as obsolete, inadequate, a relic of an earlier age. The anti-tank gun was older than the tank itself. In World War I, the first armored vehicles had been stopped by field artillery firing over open sites. Between the wars, every nation developed specialized anti-tank guns, lighter and more mobile than howitzers but powerful enough to defeat armor. The Germans had the Pak-40, a 75mm gun that could penetrate most Allied tanks. The Soviets had the ZI-S-3, a 76mm divisional gun used in both anti-tank and infantry support roles. The British had the 6-pounder, later upgraded to the 17-pounder. The Americans had the 57mm M1, a license-built version of the British 6-pounder, and later the 3-inch gun. These weapons were not glamorous, they did not have engines, did not maneuver, could not pursue. They sat in ditches, behind hedgerows, in the rubble of buildings. Their crews were not armored, had no protection except camouflage and the hope that they would see the enemy before the enemy saw them. To serve an anti-tank gun was to volunteer for a position where your first mistake would also be your last. If you missed your shot, if the enemy spotted your muzzle flash, if their machine guns found you before you could relocate, you died. Anti-tank gun crews had some of the highest casualty rates in the entire war, but they had one advantage that no tank could match. They were small. A tank was a massive target, visible from miles away, its engine noise audible long before it appeared. An anti-tank gun could be hidden in a hedgerow so thick that a Sherman driving past at 20 yards would never see it. It could be dug into a slope so that only the barrel protruded, the rest concealed by earth and sandbags. It could wait in the ruins of a building, silent and patient, while enemy armor rolled past, and then fire into the vulnerable rear armor at a range so close that even a weak gun could penetrate. This was the revelation that emerged slowly, painfully, written in the blood of countless engagements across North Africa, Italy, France and Russia. Tanks were not being destroyed primarily by other tanks. They were being destroyed by hidden guns, by ambushes, by patient crews who waited for the perfect shot and then vanished into the landscape. German casualties mounted not from grand tank battles but from sudden shocking losses. A panzer column would advance down a road, and the lead tank would explode, its turret lifting into the air. The others would stop, scan the hedgerows, see nothing, and then another would burst into flames. By the time they identified the source of fire, the gun crew had already limbered up and withdrawn, leaving only empty positions and spent shell casings. In Normandy, American infantrymen learned this lesson faster than their armor commanders. They discovered that the best way to kill a Panther was not to send a Sherman against it, but to call up a 3-inch anti-tank gun, position it in a concealed location with a clear line of fire, and wait. The Panther, arrogant and overconfident, would roll forward expecting to engage other tanks. It would present its flank for just a moment, and in that moment, the 3-inch gun would fire. At close range, even the Panther's side armor could be penetrated. The massive tank would shudder, smoke would pour from its hatches, and the crew would bail out, if they were lucky. One man who understood this better than most was Sergeant Daniel Kaczmarek, a Polish immigrant from Chicago who had enlisted in 1940 and now commanded an anti-tank gun crew in the 2nd Infantry Division. Kaczmarek was not a natural soldier. He had been a machinist before the war, a man who understood tools and precision. He did not have the swagger of a tank commander, or the recklessness of an assault trooper. What he had was patience, an eye for terrain, and an absolute refusal to waste his crew's lives on heroic stupidity. By July 1944, Kaczmarek's crew had been in Normandy for 5 weeks. They had lost 2 men to artillery, 1 to a sniper, and replaced them with fresh replacements who barely knew which end of the gun fired. Their 57mm M1 was a decent weapon, capable of penetrating most German armor at reasonable ranges, but against a Tiger it was nearly useless, unless they got a perfect side or rear shot. Kaczmarek had learned to choose his targets carefully, to let the Tigers pass, and wait for the lighter Panzer IVs and Stug assault guns that followed. His commanding officer, a captain named Brennan, who had never seen combat before Normandy, insisted that anti-tank guns should be deployed forward, in open positions where they could cover wide fields of fire. Kaczmarek ignored him. He positioned his gun in ditches, behind stone walls, inside the shattered remains of farmhouses. He sighted it so that it covered not open fields but choke points, narrow lanes where German armor would be forced to slow down and bunch up. He painted the barrel with mud, and draped it with camouflage netting cut from abandoned parachutes. He made his crew rehearse displacing after firing, timing how fast they could limber the gun, and move it 50 yards to a secondary position. On July 18, Kaczmarek's caution saved his life and his crew. The division was advancing towards St. Lo, when a German counterattack smashed into their flank. 3 Panthers and a Tiger appeared from a tree line, supported by infantry. The American tanks engaged immediately, and within minutes 4 Shermans were burning. Captain Brennan ordered all anti-tank guns to move forward and engage from the road.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Kaczmarek looked at the terrain and saw death. The road was elevated, exposed, with no cover. Any gun that deployed there would be visible to the German tanks and would be obliterated by the first return salvo. He made a decision. He waved his crew away from the road and moved his gun into an orchard 200 yards to the left, positioning it between 2 apple trees with a narrow view of the road. Minutes later he watched as 2 other anti-tank gun crews deployed where Brennan had ordered. The first managed to fire a single shot that bounced off a Panther's frontal armor before the return fire disintegrated the gun and its crew. The second never fired at all. A Tiger spotted them setting up and put a round through the gun shield, killing everyone instantly. Kaczmarek waited. The Panthers were advancing now, confident, moving toward the American infantry positions. The Tiger hung back, its commander cautious, scanning the hedgerows. Kaczmarek ignored both. He was watching a Stug 3 assault gun that was following behind the heavier tanks, moving faster, trying to flank around to hit the American infantry from the side. The Stug turned onto the road directly in front of Kaczmarek's position. For a few seconds, its side armor was exposed at less than 100 yards. Kaczmarek aimed for the junction between the hull and the superstructure, where the armor was thinnest. He did not give a fire command. His gunner, a kid from Tennessee named Willis, was already sighting. The gun roared. The armor-piercing round struck exactly where Kaczmarek had aimed. The Stug shuddered, stopped and began to burn. Before the German crews could react, Kaczmarek's crew had the gun limbered and were dragging it deeper into the orchard. They moved to a position 50 yards away, behind a stone wall, and set up again. By the time the Panthers started firing into the original position, Kaczmarek was already sighting on a second target. The battle lasted 3 hours. When it ended, the German counterattack had been repulsed. The Panthers withdrew, one of them trailing smoke from a Firefly hit. The Tiger retreated undamaged, its crew probably unaware how close they had come to an ambush. The American infantry held their positions, and in the orchard, Kaczmarek's crew sat among the apple trees, exhausted, knowing they had destroyed 2 German vehicles without losing a single man. Captain Brennan never mentioned the disobeyed order. He had seen what happened to the crews who followed his instructions. This was the pattern repeated across every front. In Italy, British 6-pounder crews knocked out German armor in the narrow mountain passes where tanks could not maneuver. In Russia, Soviet anti-tank gun brigades set up killing zones in villages, letting German columns penetrate deep before opening fire from 3 sides simultaneously. In France, American tank destroyer battalions equipped with towed 3-inch guns learned to set ambushes in the Bocage country, where every hedgerow concealed a possible fight. The Germans ironically understood this better than anyone. Their Pak 40 guns were responsible for more Allied tank losses than all German tanks combined. They positioned them with genius, calculating exact ranges, preparing alternate positions, coordinating with infantry to provide security. A well-sighted Pak 40 was almost impossible to kill without artillery or air support. But as the war progressed and Germany lost the initiative, their anti-tank guns became defensive weapons, holding ground rather than seizing it. And defense alone could not win the war. The tragedy was that so many men died, learning what should have been obvious. Tanks were vulnerable, they were loud, visible, and constrained by terrain. A well-handled anti-tank gun, hidden and patient, would almost always get the first shot. And in tank warfare, the first shot was usually the only shot that mattered. Yet commanders on all sides remained obsessed with tank versus tank combat, with the romantic notion of armored duels deciding battles. They sent their tanks forward to fight other tanks, and watched them burn. The crews of the anti-tank guns knew better. They were not romantics. They were hunters, and they understood that the way to kill a predator was not to challenge it openly, but to wait in ambush, strike from concealment, and vanish before it could retaliate. They were not heroes in the traditional sense. Many of them never received decorations, never had, but they killed more German tanks than all the Shermans, all the T-34, all the Churchills combined, and they paid for it. Anti-tank gun crews had a life expectancy measured in weeks, sometimes days. Every engagement was a gamble. Every time they pulled the lanyard and fired, they revealed their position and invited annihilation. They could not retreat quickly like a tank. They could not absorb hits like a tank. They had only camouflage, cunning, and courage. Sergeant Kaczmarek survived Normandy, survived the drive across France, survived the winter in the Ardennes. He trained 3 different gun crews as replacements for men killed or wounded. By the time his division crossed the Rhine in March 1945, he was one of the most experienced anti-tank gunners in the entire army. He had personally directed the destruction of 11 German armored vehicles, a number that would have made him an ace if he had been a fighter pilot. But he was not a pilot. He was a man who sat behind a small gun in a hole in the ground and waited for death to roll toward him on treads. On April 7th, near the town of Wesel, his luck ran out. His gun was positioned behind the rubble of a collapsed barn, covering a crossroads. A column of German armor appeared, retreating eastward, fleeing the Allied advance. Kaczmarek identified 2 Panzer IVs and a Hetzer tank destroyer. He waited until they were at optimal range, fired, and struck the lead Panzer IV in the turret ring. It stopped, smoke pouring from the hatches. The other vehicles immediately returned fire. A high-explosive shell from the Hetzer struck the barn wall directly behind Kaczmarek's position. The blast threw him 15 feet. Shrapnel tore through his leg and side. His crew dragged him back while the gunner fired one more shot, missing, and then they abandoned the gun and retreated under covering fire from infantry. Kaczmarek survived. He spent the rest of the war in a field hospital, and then was sent home. He never talked about what he did. When people asked him what it was like, he would only say that he had been in an anti-tank unit and leave it at that. The war had taught him that there was no glory in killing, only necessity, and that the men who did the necessary work were rarely the ones who received the glory. But history has a way of revealing truths that contemporaries miss. When analysts after the war studied German tank losses, they discovered something that surprised the generals, but did not surprise the men who had fought. The majority of German tanks destroyed in Western Europe were not killed by other tanks. They were killed by anti-tank guns, by artillery, by airstrikes, and by mechanical failures. Tank versus tank combat, the centerpiece of armored doctrine, accounted for less than 30% of German armor losses. The weapon that broke the Panzer myth was not a super tank, not a wonder weapon, not overwhelming numbers. It was a simple gun, towed by a truck or a jeep, crewed by men who had no armor and no illusions, who understood that their job was to hide, wait, and strike, and then to do it again until the war ended, or they died. The spring of 1945 brought revelation wrapped in fire and statistics. As Allied forces pushed deeper into Germany, intelligence officers began compiling after-action reports from every front. They interviewed survivors, examined destroyed vehicles, and photographed knocked-out German armor. What emerged from this meticulous accounting was a truth that shattered the assumptions of armored warfare doctrine. The vaunted Tiger tanks, the fearsome Panthers, the entire German armored force that had terrorized Europe for years, had not been defeated primarily by superior enemy tanks. They had been systematically destroyed by weapons their commanders had underestimated, and their crews had rarely seen until the moment of impact. The numbers told a story that pride had obscured. In Normandy alone, analysis showed that 58% of German tank losses came from anti-tank guns and towed artillery. Another 23% were destroyed by air attack, artillery bombardment, or abandoned due to mechanical failure and lack of fuel. Tank versus tank combat accounted for less than 20% of total losses. The pattern held across every theater. In Italy, the ratio was even more stark. In the final drive through Germany, as the Wehrmacht collapsed and coordination broke down, anti-tank guns and artillery claimed nearly 70% of armored kills. The Tiger tank, that symbol of invincibility, revealed itself to be a magnificent weapon hampered by fatal vulnerabilities. Yes, its armor was thick and its gun devastating, but it was also slow, mechanically unreliable, and consumed fuel at a rate that made it nearly immobile once supply lines were cut. More critically, its crews had been trained to fight other tanks in open terrain, where their advantages in range and armor could dominate. They had not been trained to recognize and counter the threat of a hidden 3-inch gun positioned in a ruined building, sighted on the exact spot where the Tiger would have to slow down to navigate rubble. German commanders had made the same error as their Allied counterparts, only from the opposite direction. They had built their doctrine around the superiority of their armor, and assumed that their technological edge would carry them through any engagement. They positioned their tanks aggressively, used them to lead attacks, and expected enemy armor to retreat before their guns. What they encountered instead were patient gun crews who let the Tigers pass, let them expose their flanks and rear, and then fired from positions so well concealed that return fire was impossible. Soviet anti-tank doctrine had been brutal but effective. Red Army commanders treated anti-tank guns as expendable, positioning them in what were essentially sacrificial ambush points. A typical Soviet defensive position would feature multiple layers of anti-tank guns, with the first line expected to be overrun and destroyed after inflicting whatever damage they could. The second line would engage the now disorganized German column. The third line would finish survivors. Soviet casualties among anti-tank crews were horrific, but the system worked. German panzer divisions that had smashed through earlier defenses found themselves bled dry, losing tanks faster than they could advance. American doctrine evolved more slowly but ultimately reached similar conclusions. The tank destroyer force, initially conceived as mobile anti-tank units equipped with fast, lightly armored vehicles, proved most effective when it abandoned mobility and fought from prepared positions. The M10 and M18 tank destroyers were excellent vehicles, but their crews learned that speed meant nothing if you were fighting from ambush. What mattered was positioning, concealment, and having a gun powerful enough to penetrate German armor. The towed 3-inch gun and later the 90mm gun proved more effective in actual combat than the more glamorous self-propelled destroyers. The British, who had suffered devastating tank losses in North Africa and Italy, embraced anti-tank warfare with grim determination. The 17-pounder gun became their salvation. Mounted on a towed carriage, it could defeat any German tank at combat ranges. British crews became masters of camouflage and ambush tactics, learning from German defensive methods and improving on them. In the final battles in Northwest Europe, British anti-tank units accounted for the majority of German armor destroyed, often without losing a single gun in return. The transformation in doctrine was not theoretical. It was written in the survival of men like Sergeant Kaczmarek and thousands like him who had learned through experience what the textbooks would later confirm. These men understood that anti-tank warfare was not about heroic charges or dramatic duels. It was about preparation, patience, and the willingness to let the enemy come to you. They learned to read terrain like a text, identifying the exact spots where enemy armor would be forced to slow down, where their flanks would be exposed, where escape routes were blocked. After the war, military analysts from every nation studied the data and reached uncomfortable conclusions. The tank, that symbol of modern mobile warfare, was far more vulnerable than anyone had admitted. Its greatest weakness was not enemy tanks but patient infantry equipped with adequate anti-tank weapons and the training to use them effectively. The Germans had known this, their pack guns had proved it repeatedly. The Soviets had known it, their massed anti-tank defenses had bled the Wehrmacht white. The Western Allies had learned it at terrible cost, but they had learned it. The lesson shaped post-war armored doctrine fundamentally. Every infantry division now included dedicated anti-tank units. Tank design began incorporating lessons learned from anti-tank combat with improved armor layout, better protection for vulnerable points, and tactics that emphasized mutual support rather than independent action. The romantic era of tank warfare, if it had ever truly existed, was definitively over. Modern armor doctrine acknowledged that tanks operating without infantry support, artillery cover, and air superiority were simply expensive targets, but the deeper lesson was about sacrifice and recognition. The men who had crewed anti-tank guns, who had sat in holes in the ground and faced down steel behemoths with nothing but a gun and their courage, received little glory. There were no movies made about them, no memoirs that became bestsellers. Tankers wrote books about their adventures. Fighter pilots became celebrities. Anti-tank gunners went home quietly if they went home at all and rarely spoke of what they had done. Sergeant Kaczmarek returned to Chicago in June 1945, his legs still stiff from shrapnel wounds. He went back to work as a machinist, married, raised 3 children, and lived a quiet life. He never joined a veterans organization, never marched in parades, never wore his medals. When his children asked about the war, he told them only that he had served in Europe and that he was glad it was over. The details, the fear, the waiting in ditches while Panthers rolled past, the moment of fighting and the desperate scramble to relocate before return fire came, these things he kept locked inside. Only once did he break his silence. In 1972, a young history student writing a thesis about anti-tank warfare in World War II somehow found his name in old unit records and wrote him a letter asking for an interview. Kaczmarek agreed, surprising his family. He spent 3 hours talking to the student, describing tactics, terrain, the technical details of the M1 gun, the psychology of ambush warfare. At the end, the student asked him if he considered himself a hero. Kaczmarek shook his head. He said that heroes charged into danger seeking glory. What he and his crews had done was different. They had accepted a job that needed doing, a job that someone had to do if the war was going to be won. They had done it with the tools they were given, which were never enough, and they had done it knowing that every engagement might be their last. There was no glory in hiding in a ditch. There was only necessity. The student published his thesis. It included a detailed account of the engagement near St. Lo, where Kaczmarek's crew had destroyed 2 German vehicles while other guns were obliterated. The thesis argued correctly that anti-tank guns had been the decisive weapon against German armor and that their crews deserved recognition as the true tank killers of World War II. The thesis received honors from the university and was later published as a book that military historians still reference. Kaczmarek never read it. He died in 1978. His family around him, his service remembered by those who loved him but unknown to history. His grandson, going through his possessions, found a single photograph from the war. It showed 6 men standing beside a 57mm anti-tank gun in an orchard somewhere in France. 5 of the men were smiling. Kaczmarek stood at the edge of the group, not smiling, his eyes looking past the camera at something the photograph could not capture. The war had taught him what it taught all who survived, that courage is not the absence of fear but the willingness to act despite it. That glory is a story told by those who were not there. That the weapons which win wars are often the ones least celebrated, wielded by men whose names are forgotten. The Tiger tank is remembered, studied, modeled by enthusiasts decades later. The M1 anti-tank gun is a footnote, a technical specification in a reference book. Yet one killed the other, again and again, across every battlefield of the European war. This was the paradox at the heart of armored warfare. The weapon designed to kill tanks was not a better tank but a simpler, older technology used with skill and determination. The men who wielded these weapons were not armored knights but patient hunters. They did not seek fair fights or honorable combat. They sought to survive and to win, and they understood that the way to do both was to strike from hiding and vanish before the enemy could respond. Modern warfare has moved beyond the technology of 1945, but the lesson remains. Superiority in equipment means nothing without proper tactics. The most powerful weapon is useless if improperly employed. And the soldiers who win wars are often not the ones with the best machines, but the ones who understand how to use what they have to maximum effect. The Tiger tank was a masterpiece of engineering. The men who destroyed it used guns that were obsolete before the war began. They won because they were willing to do what was necessary, to accept terrible risks, to sit in exposed positions and wait for death to approach so they could strike it down. The records show that anti-tank guns accounted for the majority of German armor destroyed in World War II. The records also show that anti-tank gun crews suffered casualty rates exceeded only by infantry assault units. These facts are connected. The weapon that defeated the Panzer did so at enormous cost, paid by men who rarely received recognition for their sacrifice. History remembers the Tiger, the Sherman, the T-34. It remembers Patton and Rommel and Guderian. It remembers tank battles at Kursk and the Ardennes. But in the end, what actually knocked out German tanks in World War II was not other tanks. It was artillery, air power, mechanical failure, fuel exhaustion, and above all it was small groups of determined men crouched behind anti-tank guns, waiting in ambush, striking from concealment, dying in disproportionate numbers but never stopping, never retreating, holding their positions until the enemy was destroyed or they were. That is the answer history tried to forget but the evidence cannot erase. The humble anti-tank gun dismissed and overlooked proved to be the true king of the battlefield. And the men who served those guns, who lived in terror and died in flames, who never asked for glory and rarely received it, they were the ones who broke the back of German armor and helped win the war. Their legacy is not in monuments or memorials, it is in the doctrine of every modern army, in the recognition that anti-tank warfare is not a supporting role but a primary mission. It is in the understanding that technology alone does not win battles, that tactics and courage matter more than steel. And it is in the quiet knowledge, held by those who were there, that the deadliest weapon on the battlefield is not always the most famous. The Pacific still holds the wrecks of the devastators, silent and forgotten. The fields of Europe hold the rust of countless anti-tank guns buried in the earth they defended. Both told the same story in different ways, that sacrifice without recognition is still sacrifice, that defeat can purchase victory, that the men who change history are often the ones history forgets, and that sometimes the weapon that seems weakest, wielded by those with the most courage, becomes the instrument that breaks empires and ends wars. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.